After the disaster at Dunkirk in mid-June 1940, the vast majority of British armament supplies were left deserted along the northern coast of now occupied France, and besides the fact that these tanks are now lost, it was quickly apparent that they got in the situation due to the insuperiority of French and British armored fighting vehicles. The only exceptions being the Char B-1 and the Matilda 1 and 2, the latter of which counterattacked the SS Division Totenkampf and the Wehrmacht 5th and 7th Panzer Divisions, halting the attack orchestrated by none other than Erwin Rommel himself, even taking back land lost just hours before. The Matildas were impervious to even the largest tank-mounted guns at the time, the famous short-barrel 75mm howitzers mounted on the famous Panzer IV. Despite the low number of Allied tanks in the battle, the panic even got to Erwin Rommel, reporting that he was being attacked by an entire army group. Now, Rommel isn't one to normally embellish his stories and is normally cool-headed, even when actually under fire during the invasions, but anyway, I digress. The counterattack was counterattacked to make a counterattack. Rommel ordered the 88mm flat guns normally used for the anti-air role to load solid shot shells and create a kill zone. It wasn't until the Matilda tank met these guns that they could be knocked out of action. But that is enough about France. Back to a tankless British expeditionary force. Under direct order of Winston Churchill for British factories capable of building tanks to build anything, good or bad, just to get something to defend the British Islands from the apparent invasion from Nazi Germany. This resulted in competent designs such as the Matilda II, to later become known as the Queen of the Desert, and incompetent, outlandish designs such as the Bison armored truck made of concrete and a worse power-to-weight ratio than the original Mark I landship. But this would not make up for the 256 Panzer II tanks, 678 Czech-designed Panzer 38Ts, 2,213 Panzer III. Compare this to Britain, which made only 1,379 tanks in total in 1940, a good number of which were still in France. However, Britain had another option for acquiring armor, the USA. Despite the US being neutral, they instated the cash and carry policy, which allowed nations to buy military hardware from private entities, but must pay with physical currency and must be solely responsible for transport of the hardware at their own risk. In October 23, 1941, this was extended to make the Lend-Lease Act. On May 21, 1936, U.S. Ordnance requested a new design for a medium tank with a complete redesign of their prior tanks. However, it was to reuse as many parts from their earlier M2 light tank as possible, including the VVS suspension system, transmission, and the right radial R975 9-cylinder engine. Note, this is a radial engine, the same used on aircraft, so the tank itself had to be really tall to fit this. For armament, at the time, the US was going through a phase where they followed an ideology that other historians have called the cult of the machine gun. This cult basically meant that they would strap as many 30 and 50 cals to any surface of the tank. There were 4 turrets, 2 forward and 2 back sporting 30 caliber machine guns from Browning on each side of the hull. Above was a turret sporting a 37mm anti-tank gun and a hexagonal turret. However, later versions replaced the turret with another hexagonal turret. The driver sat in the middle, elevated above the transmission, in a protruding armored box to get a good field of view. Also, because more machine guns were a must, the driver had a 2 30 caliber machine guns mounted permanently forwards, embedded in the hull. In the end, there was a crew of 6 men, 1 driver, 4 machine gunners, manning the 4 machine gun turrets, and the commander in a turret with the 37. If you know a little about tanks, you'll know that historically it's a reoccurring theme that when the commander is forced to multitask by loading and firing the gun, looking for targets and ordering the driver around, the crew's effectiveness rapidly depletes. It was clear that by 1938, when this thing entered service, it was already obsolete with its thin armor and reliance on machine guns. During the war, the M2 was relegated to crew training for the first parts of the war, but was later replaced by the overabundance of M4 Shermans. But now, in December 1940, it was time to create an arsenal of democracy. A plan for the U.S. to build and operate a huge military to deter other nations away from the U.S. interests, mainly Germany. At this time, the Panzer III M and T-34 with the 76 cannon were already fighting, and the British Churchill tank was already in trials. Clearly, the M2 medium with the puny 37mm would not suffice for the roles needed. It's important to remember, American armored doctrine was to have medium tanks support the infantry, and the tank destroyers were to destroy enemy armor. People have interpreted this that the U.S. medium tanks, mainly the Shermans, were never intended to fight tanks. This is not true, for the very reason that part of infantry support is to destroy tanks that the infantry might face. But anyway, the new version of the M2 would be called the M3. I know, it's very creative. The M3 would need to expand upon this need to fight enemy armor with a new gun, the M1897 75mm cannon. Please note, this gun has been falsely described as an anti-infantry gun, but is a multi-purpose weapon. It was considered as an anti-tank gun by the Army Ordnance Board, and was used in early tank destroyers such as the M3 GMC, and the Test T-18 tank destroyer from none other than Firestone Tire. But anyway, this was mounted on the hull similar to a casemate tank destroyer, and another 37mm cannon from the M2 on a turret in the opposite side of the hull was as a counterweight. And on the top of this was a smaller turret supporting a 30 caliber machine gun. This design was strictly a stopgap measure. Remember the British order I mentioned in the beginning? This is what was needed while a better design could be worked out. The M4 was already designed by now, but key technologies like the turret were not yet complete. The tank had a higher and wider hull than the preceding M2. To be able to mount the 75, originally, there was to be a 30 cal for an anti-air fully traversing turret, but was scaled down to the small commander's cupola. The 75 could fire solid shot or AP, heat or high explosive anti-tank, and HE or high explosive for anti-infantry roles. But the 37 was specifically for the AT role. Like before, there were machine guns for the driver, but this could not be moved around. The suspension was identical to the M2's, but including another set of bogies to have a smoother ride. Two different hulls were built. One was constructed of riveted armor around a frame and chassis. This was outdated and dangerous for the crew. This was because if hit, even if the armor wasn't penetrated, the rivets could spall backwards towards the enemy, killing or severely wounding them. The other was referred to as the M3A1, and this had a completely cast hull, but was too costly, difficult and time-consuming to produce to meet the British demand. The driver was still sitting in the middle of the vehicle, with a 5-speed manual transmission and the same double lever steering system as before. With the same R975 radial engine as before, it was reasonably powered for its weight. The 37mm also had a hydroelectric stabilizer. As the British bought the M3 though, they realized some aspects did not meet their specifications. This included the hull-mounted radio and the obsessive amounts of machine guns. This resulted in the M3 Grant. The British made the version with the same armament, but used a redesigned turret without a machine gun cupola, and inserted a radio for the commander to use in the back of the turret. This resulted in the radio operator being booted, and resulted in a 6-man crew compared to the US's 7. The M3 Grant and the US M3 Lee tanks were first used in North Africa in Operation Torch. However, the quick development of its successor saw it out of service quickly in the Western theaters, but saw extensive use with Soviet forces, and the tank was also used heavily by the British in Burma and Southeast Asia against the Japanese, who had much lighter tanks. But the M3's peak was short-lived. Quickly, its successor came rolling forward, leaving fire in its wake like the great Civil War general named after it, the M4 Sherman. Seeing combat on every continent the war was fought, in every theater, only the Soviet T-34 were built in greater numbers. In the end, 50,000 Shermans were built. The hull was that of the M3, but with everything track up being redesigned. However, it was still monstrously tall. Each track was made of 78 track links with the same bogie suspension system, forward drive sprocket, and the rear return roller as the M2 and M3. The prototype was called the T6 prototype, with the second one, Michael, in the Bovington Tank Museum in the UK. Looking at Michael, you can see the strange familiarity of a Sherman, but there are still some things off, such as the two machine guns stuck in the hull, the strange cast turret with a strange bulge on the left side. Entering service as the M4 medium tank in 1942 in North Africa, all Shermans were combined into the 2nd Armored, or as I should say, all U.S. Shermans were combined into the 2nd Armored Division under Patton to reinforce the British in Egypt, which at the time were under the serious threat from Rommel and his panzer divisions. After the Second Battle of El Alamein, the Germans were driven west by the British, but Patton was moving east and would press the Germans in Tunisia. These Shermans were the M4A1 type, with a cast hull and turret with a 75mm gun, capable of knocking out the German Panzer III and IVs, even though the side of the Sherman's hull was weaker and provided a large target. In 1942, the frontal armor of the turret hull were just as good, and if not better, than the Germans' armor, capable of deflecting some of the KWK-40s. Initial reactions to the Sherman was pretty positive, despite being its common conception. The name Ronsons, because they light every time, is not really appropriate. In a British report on the Sherman, it was reported that the Sherman would have a burn rate of 82%, while the contemporaries such as the Panzer IV had a burn rate of only 80%. However, the Americans indicated a burn rate as low as 60%. This was not because of any high-octane fuel, but because of the ammunition stowage. This was solved with wet stowage and is unlikely for the Sherman to immediately burst into flames after modification. With wet stowage, the burn rates went down to just 15 to 20%. Even though the tank does catch fire, the later modifications of spring-loaded hatches and the inclusion of a loader's hatch allowed the Sherman crew to rapidly escape the tank. Even though the tank does catch fire, the later modifications of spring-loaded hatches and the inclusion of a loader's hatch allows the crew to rapidly escape the tank. For example, here's Nicholas Moran, or better known as the Chieftain, demonstrating the time required to get out of various tanks contemporary to the Sherman.
Imagine, if you would, you just had that significant emotional event of a shell penetrating your tank, and a fire has now started. Okay, it's lovely, toasty and warm, you're on the Russian front, a little bit of flame is good, but you decide, let's get out. So, oh my god, the tank is on fire. Crank up the hatch to open protected. Come right, get the periscope out of the way, and well, you probably wouldn't bother with lowering it, but then you gotta get out. This takes a while.
Little strength I have left in my left leg after holding down the clutch for so much, it's not a light clutch. I'm going to attempt to egress in the traditional manner out the driver's hole. I am told head first, chest up is the preferred technique. Not having my foot stuck is probably a good start. What the hell with the preferred technique? Okay, who put the steering lever in the way? Halfway there. as I almost fall off the front slope. Fortunately, the spare track links almost broke my fall. You know, if the tank's on fire, I'm going to get out the turret.
This is again the small hatch Sherman. Now, the thing about Shermans is that although they have a reputation of being death traps, they weren't. On average, the Americans found that they lost maybe 0.6 of a person per killed tank. The survivability rating of this tank was higher than pretty much any other tank on the battlefield per knocked out tank. And part of the reason for it is, once they fixed the loader's hatch issue, which I think I mentioned before, getting out of a Sherman is really, really easy. Bear in mind, this is the small hatch Sherman, so I will try the "oh bugger, the tank is on fire" test with a small hatch Sherman, and well, let's see how I do. Now, one last point I'll note before I conduct the test is that there is a minor cheat. In 1943, they started issuing spring kits. Before that, the tank, to open up the doors, you were fighting against the full weight of the hatch. However, come 43, someone decided, let's put springs on it, make it much easier to open and get out. And this is one of these retrofitted tanks. Of course, off the production lines, they were added as well. So, without further ado, oh bugger, the tank is on fire. Try doing that in a T-34 or a Comet. Won't work.
Another example was captured on film during the famous Cologne tank duel when the second lieutenant Karl Kellner was able to escape from a stricken Sherman. He would make his way to a medic but would succumb from his critical blood loss from his missing leg. Note, this leg was knocked off when the tank shell passed through the Sherman's armor and struck him in the leg, proving that the Sherman was easy to escape because, I mean, he didn't have a leg on, and he was still able to escape and climb down. However, the wet stowage would take time to implement, so Shermans, especially with the standard M4 variant, welded extra steel plates over ammo racks and covered the gunner's position with extra steel. From 42 to 43, 44-ish, the 75mm was adequate for dealing with armor. It wasn't the most overkill, high-velocity gun like the 75s of the Panther or Panzer IVs or the 88mm of the Tiger, but would still deal with threats it faced. Tigers were really rare to encounter, and the 75 had no problem with the side armor of the Panthers and Tigers. 69% of the encounters with Panthers were from the side. Most engagements of tanks were from the side, so it was clear why the US tank crews themselves preferred and the tried and true concept of the shorter 75. In fact, the 75mm gun could penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger I from closer ranges, but this was rare. Another advantage was the hydroelectric stabilizer that allowed the gun to remain on target for most speeds. Also keeping the gun stable while coming to a stop, allowing the Sherman to get the first shot off, which is important because 75% of the time, the tank that fires first survives. The Sherman was designed to be modular, capable of replacing engines or transmissions or even the gun and turret. The turret was always designed to be upgraded to a 76mm, explaining a large gun shield for the M4. However, it left inadequate room inside. And because ergonomics was a major part of US design doctrine, this resulted in a separate turret. These tanks were ready for deployment for the invasion of Europe, but were kept in England due to the skepticism of tank crews of a new, unproven gun for the platform. It wasn't until the heavy use of Panthers and heavier armor in France that tank crews started using the 76mm cannon. The 76mm cannon was capable of punching a hole through the front of a Tiger I's armor within about 400 yards. As a result, German gunners were trained to fire at the longer-barreled Shermans like the M476s and Fireflies, resulting in Allied tankers occasionally disguising the guns as shorter barrels. As for the other Shermans, it was a practice to try and close the distance with a German tank. They needed to take out the gun and disable it to effectively... They just needed to take out the gun to effectively disable the tank. Sometimes it was reported that Sherman loaders would load white phosphorus shells to shoot and try to burn and disable the engine and the crew, but this wasn't widespread. Just as any invading force, it was common for the defenders to suffer fewer casualties than the attacker, and this was the same for the Sherman and German tanks. The main reason the kill counts were so high because they were pushing into unfamiliar land, and the German AT guns and tanks were in ambush positions with kill zones set up to destroy the unsuspecting convoys. Normally taking out the lead tank, then the tank in the rear so the convoy couldn't move, then pick them off while they struggle to identify where the shells are coming from. But the other important thing about the Sherman was it was very repairable. The transmission could be bolted and lifted off and replaced with an all-new one, unlike the German tanks that required cranes and pulleys and specialized equipment to do just one small repair. This means even though a Sherman couldn't move, it could be recovered, repaired, and sent out again. It was this modular design also that allowed upgrades to be made, like the replacing of the radial engine with the V8 and diesel versions for the Russians, and the VVVS suspension, like on the M4A1, to the HVVS suspension like on the M4A3E8, or better known as the EZ8. This allowed the Sherman platform to be used on every front of the war, making up 20% of Soviet tanks in the entire war. The Sherman was perfect for the US war machine, being the required dimensions to fit on a cargo ship and be lifted by a crane, fit onto a train car, and being light enough to traverse bridges. An issue German tanks suffered heavily from. Pun intended. But over the Far East, Shermans with a short 75 were very useful in the Pacific. With a short barrel, it allowed the turret to be traversed in denser foliage. The smaller gun wasn't an issue either because of the inferior Japanese armor, but it was very vulnerable to the Japanese high-velocity 45mm AT gun mounted in ambush positions at the side of the tank. After the war, the Shermans were sent to Korea, seeing use there, but slowly replaced by the M46 Patton tanks. And by 1954, the outdated Shermans were removed from the U.S. service. The Sherman was a very iconic and potent vehicle in military history circles. In the past, it has been given a bad rap from biased opinions and stereotypes, but in later years, it has seen much more of a better view. As for me, I believe it was a relatively good tank. It wasn't the most powerful, fastest, or most armored, but it was a jack of all trades, and does everything asked for it optimally and effectively.